Hello, welcome to the second session on science, Deleuze and Guattari. And allow me to introduce our first speaker, which is Ewa Szumilewicz from Poland. And she will give a talk on the notion of time for Lacan and Deleuze in the light of quantum mechanics and general theory of relativity. So as you all see, it's very dense topic, very dense paper, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Ewa, please, I give you the word.
So, hello, it's really great to have the opportunity to share my ideas with you. I think I will just start. So, if one were to compare Lacan's notion of time with Deleuze's notion of time, one could say, or I would say, that Deleuze's idea can be illustrated by the notion of time that functions in a quantum theory, whereas Lacan's notion of time can be illustrated by the Einstein's concept, generality of relativity, and this is exactly the stake for my presentation. I will start with theory of relativity and quantum mechanics solely in this aspect of time. So the most important conclusion from the theory of relativity for the concept of time is that there is no place in space that exists outside of time, or more precisely, time and space form a single space-time continuum. Physical processes taking place in the background of space-time continuum are not independent of it because they can, and they in fact do shape the space-time continuum itself. Contrary, the quantum theory takes into account this continuity. According to this theory, electrons, as well as the other elementary particles, do not cross classical tracks out in space, but appear in different places in a certain area of a space near the track defined by the classical mechanism. Thus, the quantum description of the electron gives only the area of the highest probability density of finding the electron. Heisenberg stated that the more accurately we determine the momentum of the given electron, the less accurately we can determine its position. So following the Heisenberg principle, otherwise called the uncertainty principle, the state of the atomic system or elementary particle cannot be precisely stated. And I would say in short that the more precisely we know when the particle appears, the less precisely we know when it appears and the other way around. And although those two theories, general theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, enable, in a way, full understanding of processes occurring in the nature, their synthesis is not possible because after combining the equation of quantum mechanical probability, some processes have infinite values in results. It's worth noting, in my opinion, that both theories, the general theory of relativity and the quantum mechanics, require different position for the observer. In general theory of relativity, the observer is a part of the phenomenon. I would say he's like an element of a game. While in quantum mechanics, the observer is I would call it like external frame of reference for the phenomenon that takes place beyond. And I think that perhaps this is the philosophical meaning of the incompatibility of the two theories. So it was like an introduction to those both theories. And with the notion of time, I will start with Lacan, which will be referred to general theory of relativity. And Lacan's logical structure of time is analyzed in detail by the philosopher in his article, Logical Time and the Assertion of the Anticipated Certainty. I will recall the context. So the context is as follows. The prisoner's warden announces to 3 chosen prisoners that the one who first solves the logical riddle and guesses the color of the disc will be released. The riddle is as follows. The warden announces to the 3 prisoners that there are 5 discs, and 3 of them are white and 2 of them are black. Next, the warden fixes on the back of each prisoner a white disc. As it fixes on the back, each prisoner can see the companion's disc, but not his own. And on that ground, and of course knowing that in general there are those 5 discs, like 3 white and 2 black, on that ground they are supposed to deduce the color of their own disc. And what is important here, the warden states that all kind of probabilistic reasoning is forbidden here. So it's like the logical called conclusion, what can be done. So let's look at the prisoners. How can they logically deduce the color of the discs? And I will present the reasoning solely for the prisoner A, because for the B and the C, the reasoning is the same. They all have the same situation, like all have white discs. And the situation is as follows. So A thinks like this. A assumes that his disc is black. What would B then see? He wonders. He would see me, this A, with a black disc and C with a white. Next, he would discern that C doesn't leave the room, because if he had left the room, it would mean that B's disc is black. As we know, if C saw A and B with a black disc, he would be sure that his disc could not be black. Thus, it has to be white, because as we remember, there are only two black discs. And let's remember that this is all the time the reasoning for the prisoner A. So prisoner A sees that neither B nor C leaves the room. And on that ground, he concludes that his disc cannot be black, and it's white. And the B and C, I mean the other prisoners, performed the analogical reasoning simultaneously. Thus, they three concluded the color of their own discs, I mean white, at the same time, simultaneously, and they left the room at the same time. But the riddle, Lacan's riddle, I mean, in a way brilliant, raises many doubts as to me. So first, the Lacanian disquisition is based on axiomat of classical logic. The possibilities of choices are narrow into binary opposition. So either the disc is black or white. So to put it jokingly, couldn't it be that in a fanciful gesture, the warden affixes to one of the prisoners' back, let's say, pink disc? Next, the depiction assumes the intellectual potential of the prisoners as equal. That's why the deduction can be made at exactly the same time. But what if one is faster and he makes the deduction faster and leaves the room earlier? So wouldn't it put at stake the reasoning for the two reasoners, the conclusion for the two prisoners? And next, it is assumed that the situation takes place in conditions that are not influenced by any external factors that may interfere the process. Using the terminology of the modern science, we would say that they are in the inertial system, but can't we hypothesize that one of the discs was, let's say, set inaccurately and falls, and therefore doesn't time pass? In other words, is there any place for fluctuation or unpredictability in the Lacan's reasoning? And I would say that no. Next, in my opinion, the warden takes place of the position of Deus ex machina. So first, he sets laws and rules of the prisoner's world and simultaneously sets himself beyond the relation within the notion of flow of time. The warden dictates and creates all the conditions and possibilities of the game and simultaneously occupies the metaplane of the whole narrative. And even if we assume this, I would say, ad hoc ethical perspective, as Lacan did, because he also refers to the ethic, it's rather a rigid ethic, as there is no possibility of changing the rules of the game while time flows. The warden cannot change the rules of the game in the middle of the game. In other words, there is no possibility of changing the ethical assumptions in the middle of the game. When analyzing the philosophical implication of the riddle, Lacan refers solely to the relation between the three prisoners. The position of the warden is not taken into account at all. And what is more, in my opinion, there is no possibility of conducting a logical analysis of the position of the warden, as his position is, I would call, like the absolute frame of reference, as well as the necessary condition within the whole situation may occur. Lacan's time can be considered only if referred to the other. As we know, the prisoner is able to deduce the color of his own disc only if he refers to the situation of his companions. So time considered here is relative. And this approach I would apply as a metaphor to the approach that is rooted in generality of relativity. because there time can only be considered as the relation between objects. In general theory of relativity, the landscape of whole or structure can be taken under consideration only if referred to the absolute point of reference. I mean, the passage of the time can be assumed if related to, let's say, sun, moon, or any other object. In general theory of relativity, the observer is a part of the game, but the game can take place only if referred to the absolute frame of reference, this aforementioned sun or moon, which I think functions exactly like the warden in the story of Lacan. When we are looking at Lacan's time, one cannot omit the eyes of the other. Lacan's time, contrary to Deleuze, is the time that emerges as an effect of the relation with of others. Deleuze, on the other hand, understands time as individuals' disposition. And here in my presentation, I will focus on the notion of time that Deleuze holds in the logic of sense. However, Deleuze's intuition is similar within all his philosophy as far as time is concerned, at least in terms of that this is the construct, I mean time, which is rather being the individual disposition than the relation, the result of the relations. For Lacan, there is always one interpretation of time, which is a result of those relations between individuals. And for Deleuze, the starting point is always more than one interpretation of the notion of time. Either this is aion chronos, as it's in the logic of sense, or there are three notions of time, as it's in difference at repetition, and though they are, of course, different in some aspects. But what matters for the needs of my presentation is that Deleuze time is always like at start wounded, I would say cracked, in parts, the one that is having more than one interpretation. And in the logic of sense, this is aion and chronos. Aion, this past future place of depth, paradoxically the one that doesn't have itself a direction as such, and chronos, which is the present that measures in a way like a cold Swiss precision watch past future forms, cutting them into single instances on the now, but only in the surface. Looking at the structure of aion, one could say that this time, this depth time, is rather a set of possibilities than states existing as such. Aion is a connection of all possible configurations, is actualized and in a way trivialized by the moment of the chronos cut. Such a depiction of time can be related, in my opinion, to the one that exists in quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics does not allow to predict a result of a single measurement. This is a theory that reflects the probability of possibility of the result, and time and space are not inscribed in the landscape of quantum mechanics, or more precisely, time and space in the landscape of quantum mechanics can only be captured when an external observer enters the stage as an external frame of reference for the simultaneous quantum phenomenon. A quantum event is then limited to space and time in which is observed by the observer. The observer is therefore, using philosophical terminology, a transcendental frame of reference. And for comparison, general theory of relativity does not have any frame of reference as such, because time is a part of the game. It's like an active player, and also the observer is a part of the game. The stability in a way of the world is not being questioned, as it's all incorporated time also in the framework of the structure as such. But it's worth keeping in mind, however, that within this theory, as it was mentioned, the time is relative. It constitutes a relation between entities or subjects which are related to the absolute point of reference, the aforementioned sun, moon. Quantum mechanics is a theory beyond space and time. An external reference frame is needed to capture the events. Time, in a way, lacerates the event, hence to catch the event is to wound. There is an essential instability of the world, as it can be only grasped from the perspective of the movement of time. The structure itself freezes in actuality, trivialized in the coil present, like the chronos act. Quantum theory is a theory of probability, density of occurring an event, or to say the one where ontological status as such of particles event is puzzling or disputable. It is disputable starting from the foundation of the theory. If we look at the double slit experiment, I mean, when the light and matter are both of wave and particle structure, as long as they are not being measured, and when measured they split into particles solely. And here the ion structure comes to mind. The fundamental characteristic of quantum world implies inability or limitation of the ability of the observer to predict a result of a single experiment. And this is also how, among others, the aforementioned Heisenberg principle works. All these trigger question about the ontological status of the quantum mechanic landscape. Is it potential, virtual, real in its multiplicity, and split when measured, having the potential to be, or rather being as such? I think there is a space for the discussion here. What actualizes a certain state in Deleuze work is that Deleuze is the gesture of Chronos act or Chronos cut. Deleuze time is an internal disposition of an individual, and Lacan's time is a field of all possible configurations of I-other relations. For both, the gesture of cut actualizes and, I would say, trivializes the state. The Deleuze cut takes place rather on the ontological plane, while in Lacan's case, this is the ethical plane, this guard functioning there as Deus ex machina. By the way, as it was, I think, slightly sketched, Lacan's ethic presented in the essay Logical Time and the Assertion of Anticipated Certainty is a rigid, pre-adjust, immobile ethics. It's not possible to change the ethical assumptions of the game during the game. The guard is unable to change the conditions of the game when the game is on. And also, the way Lacan perceives time is not the same as in generality of relativity, although for both Lacan and Einstein, the axial is the element of relativity. I think it's treated slightly different. The passage of time in generality of relativity focuses on an I-other relation with the antimatic or rooted presumption or premise of isomorphism, or other words, sameness of the world. Lacan, on the other hand, assumes isomorphism of time of I-other, prescinding from the shape and the appearance of the world. So this is this immutability of the shape of the Mobius stripe, understood here as the necessary condition for the ethical relation as such, those rules of the Warden, I would say. Generality of relativity equations, which is quite, I would say, funny, are adiabatic equations. Adiabatic is understood here classically as heat exchange with the environment. Thus, the question arises about the paradoxical environment. After all, there is no external as to generality of relativity. And for Lacan, this paradoxical abiatism would manifest itself in the very shape of the world, the immutability of preset ethical assumptions. And ending, I try to refer Lacan to generality of relativity and Deleuze to the quantum mechanic. Generality of relativity has a subject as one of the elements of the theory. In principle, the frame of reference does not exist as such because the subject is inside the world. Therefore, in order to scrutinize relations, it is necessary to establish the absolute point of reference, sun, moon, like a Lacanian word. The quantum world as such can only be studied from the perspective of the external observer. Metaphorically speaking, the subject enters the stage in a chosen time and space, and from the entire quantum world cuts a piece of that world that he subjects to research. The observer functions in a way like the absolute time and space as the main stage of the quantum theory. And there is no other way, because I would say jokingly, quantum will not examine the other quantum. I just hope that two positions are now visible. One, when the subject is the internal part of the world, and here I mean theory of relativity and the Lacan, and the one when there is external reference frame need to cut to subject. And this is the quantum world and Deleuze. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ewa, for a wonderful talk on time, and also for minding the time of this panel. So you've been very strict, and I certainly appreciate it. But we started later, and we still have a few minutes for discussion. So if there are any questions, please type them in a chat. Of course, Alain and Michael are free to ask their questions. So, yeah.
Actually, I do have a question. So I found it interesting that at the end you put Deleuze on the side of an account of time with an external observer, and I'm wondering how you would square that with something like Deleuze's commitment to immanence.
Can you say again? Sorry, it's a little bit.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I said, so I was surprised at the end that you end up with Deleuze on the side of an external account of time, like an external viewer. And I'm wondering how that squares with Deleuze's commitment to immanence.
I mean, I think I haven't ended with Deleuze with the external commitment to time. What I wanted to say is that the landscape of the structure is such, both in the Deleuzean world and the quantum world is such, when it's, I would say, trivialized or cut into the piece, like it's the gesture of the chronos, it's the one that can be subjected as such. So I would say there is a different starting point for the generality of relativity and the quantum theory. So in other words, Deleuze would be because I would, in short, he would be the one who, on one hand, sees all potential and possibilities of all states existing as such, and also shows what happens if we want to make a kind of a test or research as such, or make it active or alive, or however. This I have on my mind is the chronos, purely part of the time. Yes, I think it's a half of the answer, because you also mentioned something about the eminence. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So can you say again?
Just so trying to think of how to rephrase it, because it sounds like you have there's time unfolding and there's a perceiver outside and like not as involved with the states as you say in the Lacan special relativity example, and that strikes me as a very transcendent description where the viewer is outside. I'm wondering if I'm misunderstanding that, or
I'm not sure, because I quite don't get the essence of what you want to say, probably due to my limping English. So if you are patient enough, try to tell me more slowly and again.
I say, well, we can talk about it later. And
I would be really happy to grasp your objection, but I can't.
Or maybe, Michael, you can type it in a chat, and Ewa will have a time to get back to it later on, so that we have space for another question.
In general, what I know for sure is I don't quite get what you mean by the eminence, and where is the place of that in both Deleuze theory. What do you mean by eminence, and how the way I referred the Deleuze time and the way what is the relation between this, and what puzzles you? I would be happy to answer. Okay.
Yeah, Alain.
Ewa, thanks for your presentation. I wonder if you had time to think about the possible connection between Deleuze, Guattari, and chaos theory in relationship with quantum theory. It seems to me that quantum theory provides some kind of theoretical tools, let's say, to think about the unpredictability or the uncertainty of the microscopic world, let's say, whereas chaos theory provides theoretical tools to think about the uncertainty of the macro visible world, and it was initiated by Poincaré and then the fractal theory by Mandelbrot, etc. So I think Deleuze and Guattari were in fact interested in both of these aspects of new science. I wonder if you had time to think about the connection.
I was thinking many times, yes, and I don't have like ready answers, but what was interesting for me just to think was that you're perfectly right. It is something like kind of a similar sensitivity as to the quantum mechanics in the micro scale and the chaos theory in a big scale. But this is also what I try to sketch here, that there is this kind of a rip or a kind of a price we have to pay for. I mean, the measurement, if you want to take in the quantum theory, is the one. And with the chaos theory, as you know, we have something like fixed attractors as such, and it works as long as we take it like for granted, because in general, they are taken for granted a little bit, I would say. And then it's kind of like an absolute point of reference, I would say. It works very well, like everything works very well, but this is the very limitation of the theory, because the attractor is like another scale given to the chaos theory. What is, on the other hand, I would say it's like the self-organizing theories. And I don't have like the ready answer, what is good, wrong, or whatever, but I know it's like kind of a different perspective. A self-organizing theory, we probably know, yes, like it starts from the ants or the way the stars and galaxies are shaped. The kind of a theory where no attractors are needed. I would say it's kind of like an anarchy-like theory. I really like it in a way, but this is the kind of a theory when we have no fixed points. The things are just emerging and happening as such on the different scale. But still, there are some questions as such. Still, this is possible. But yes, I truly agree with you, and this is also my intuition that those two are in a way similar, but I like to think about things in kind of like juxtaposition. I don't have any answers in a way, but I like to, juxtapose. So yes, quantum theory, yes, and I like to have, on the other hand, in my mind that there is the theory of relativity, and yes, chaos theory is great, but I like to also remember that there is the rival theory, which is also, a little bit heart-taking, the self-organization theory. I don't know if it's the answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, in the meantime, Michael typed his question in the chat, so if you want to take a look at it, and if you feel like answering right now.
Okay, my question was that the Deleuze quantum connection, it sounded like you were describing the observer as beyond or outside what happens in time, at least more so than in general theory of relativity view. If so, that seems to me a transcendental account on the observer as time. And I was wondering if is my misunderstanding that, and if not, how do you see that as consistent with Deleuze's commitment to immanence and his rejection to transcendent explanations? Okay, now I see it. So I know Deleuze's commitment to immanence as such is strong, and I would say this is exactly his commitment to the plane of consistency, which, I'm just thinking now, would be referred to just the very world of the very quantum world as such. And the fact that always time as such, in the view of Deleuze, is the one that is teared apart or in parts. This is what where he sees this dramatic moment. Like I would say that each naming of, or each creation, or each concept, which if they are the concept as such, but the rigid concepts, has a price you pay for. And I think I would see it this way. I think so. Those yes, this is how I see it.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Maybe if you allow for one more question. It's a massive question, but maybe you can answer it with one strict no. So it's up to you. But if I got you right, you argued that the difference between Lacan's and Deleuze's notion of time somehow resembles the difference between Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. I see your point, but I wonder what's the reason of this difference? And my hypothesis or a hypothetical answer, my suggestion would be, is it because Lacan's psychoanalytic praxis? Is it because of his clinical experience, which was so important to him? And of course, the notion of time in psychoanalysis is a huge topic, and there are tons of literature on this. So the massive question I'm asking is, do you think that this difference between Lacan's and Deleuze's notion of time is somehow related to the notion of time or the experience of time in psychoanalytic praxis?
I mean, I know, I get your point. It's a great question. Thank you. I mean, yes, of course, and to many different things. Like the one was rather making structures is what is such. The other, I mean, Deleuze rather wanted to see events as becoming and the relations between them. So many answers I would think. But I mean, the closer to me is the one that there is a completely different position of the notion of the subject as to Lacan and as to Deleuze. I think it's everywhere in Lacan's work that the subject as such is a kind of a, saying in short, a rigid structure, or let's say a result of either cultural norms or signifiers or any other things. And the relation with the other is what makes just a psychoanalysis working. And I would say that for Deleuze, the notion of the subject is very, very disputable. I mean, his beloved Joe Basquiat words were, "My wounded existed before me." So this is the notion of the time, which is just torn apart just at the very start. So where Lacan has those kind of, I would say, gestures to see things as such and to build the structures to make the, I don't know, starting from the very practical reason to make the psychoanalysis work, Lacan has like the mad tears to show that the philosophy has like to make one step further and to not stop, even if it hurts. I don't know, something like that. I would say that the subject is something completely different here.
Okay, Ewa, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for your questions. And unfortunately, time, that merciless beast, has put us already under pressure, and we must continue. This time, it's Alain Beaulieu's presentation. So let me introduce Alain briefly. He is affiliated to the Laurentian University in Canada, and he will give a talk on the age of the cosmic in the artistic works of Kandinsky, Klee, and Stockhausen. It may sound as purely artistic topic, but we will see that it is also related to the cosmological theories, and therefore Alain's presentation is absolutely topical in this panel. So Alain, I give you the word.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Indeed, my presentation has a lot to do with art and also with science. The thing is that my topic changed a little bit since last year, and but still it's connected with science. So I will try to share my PowerPoint. I hope it's working. If it's not, you can let me know. Okay, can you see it?
Yeah, now we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So the only thing I can see on my side is my PowerPoint. So I don't see you anymore, and I cannot see me. There might be an option, but I didn't find it. In any case, and so my only goal today is to make sense of the following sentence taken from 1,000 Platos. If there is a modern age, there is the sentence. If there is a modern age, it is of course the age of the cosmic. Modern arts refers here to the avant-garde of the early 20th century, initiated among others by Kandinsky in painting, Schoenberg in music, and Joyce in literature. In what sense do Deleuze and Guattari equate modern art and cosmic art? Why do previous artistic periods, say classicism and romanticism, are not primarily cosmic? And what does cosmic art means exactly for Deleuze and Guattari? Those are the first questions that needs to be addressed before discussing the work of some contemporary artists in connection with Deleuze and Guattari's standpoint on cosmicity. We have two quotes here which say similar things. The first one is from Paul Klee. As we know, Deleuze in his solo work and with Guattari often revisits it. Art does not reproduce the visible, it's a quote, rather it makes visible. The visible is only an isolated case taken from the universe, and thus there are more truth unseen than seen. The second quote is from Deleuze and Guattari, who transposed Klee's idea to philosophy. Modern philosophy tends to elaborate a material of thought in order to capture forces that are not thinkable in themselves. End of quote. Rendering artistically sensible forces that are not sensible by themselves, either visible or audible forces, capturing philosophically forces that are not thinkable by themselves, all this sounds seemingly absurd, esoteric, and even self-contradictory. Let's try to give consistency to it. The very basic idea behind the very basic idea behind grasping invisible forces is that there is more in reality than what our eyes and ears and thoughts can see, hear, and think. There is a metaphysical level of reality, if you will, that is floating right above at the surface of things and connected to them. Deleuze and Guattari call this level of reality molecular. That is, abstract art, when it successfully grasps molecular forces, still expresses nature despite the fact that the focus is on the invisible. The real paradox might lay here. Modern art, for Deleuze and Guattari, expresses nature. It expresses the molecular aspect of nature, not the physical nature, but a cosmic nature. Grasping invisible forces for Deleuze and Guattari is art's main task. And when they exemplify the forces expressed by modern artists, they refer to natural forces, for instance, the germination forces, thermic forces, magnetic forces, and the forces of eruption of life. There are certainly numerous reasons for a painter to defy figurative representation and produce abstractions, numerous reasons to express reality or nature otherwise. Among those reasons, one can think of attempting to escape romanticism, increasing the complexity of things, problematizing the correspondence between words and things, or there is perhaps a more social reason, such as responding to the growing abstraction of social relations in industrial society as developed by Adorno, for instance. Another reason for creating abstract art might be to provide an answer to the new science. However, it is worth noting that artists, painters in particular, became abstract decades before the classical Newtonian physics was shaken by the new science, as shown here in Turner's paintings. Art became modern before the new modern science emerged. In the midst of the 19th century, the English scientist Michael Faraday showed interest in magnetic fields. Faraday made major contributions in the field, but I retain here only this image that shows a bar magnet with two poles surrounded by iron fillings, which naturally take a certain direction to reveal the magnetic field through the lines of forces. And so the invisible magnetic field becomes visible. This scientific experiment shows that science can render visible natural forces that are not visible by themselves. The question now becomes, can art do similar thing or something similar? Kazimir Malevich became a key figure of Russian suprematism. The term suprematism refers to an abstract art which focuses on basic geometric forms. It is based upon, quote from Malevich, the supremacy of pure artistic feeling rather than on visible depiction of objects, end of quote. I am presenting here two of Malevich's experimental work from the 1910s. The first one, on the left, evokes magnetic attraction, and in the second one on the right, one can recognize Morse code dot dash used to visualize telegraphic messages. In both cases, something invisible is rendered visible, namely the electromagnetic forces and the telegraphic message passing through the air. At around the same time, the Russian painter Kandinsky made this painting on the left, which is credited for the first abstract watercolor painting. Neither geometric shapes nor objects or characters can be recognized. It dates back to 1910. In Western Europe, simultaneously, Cubism was at its highlight with Picasso and Braque. We can see that their work preserves some references to geometry and visible reality, as shown in the painting on the right by Picasso entitled Guitar Strings from the same year, 1910, where one can recognize strings, a body shape, and geometric forms. Kandinsky clearly didn't preserve such references. In these years, Kandinsky was closely involved in the Theosophical Society, a spiritual movement which promoted occultism and mysticism, and which basically provided an alternative to materialism. The theosophers were interested in such phenomena as clairvoyance, the aura, the synthesis of the capacity to hear colors or to see sounds. Theosophy was influential for Kandinsky, who describes his abstract works as an escape from the material world toward the spiritual one. At the Bauhaus Art School in Germany, and in his theoretical writings, he explains that the task of the artist consists in visualizing the spiritual in matter. In this context, by necessity, art has to become abstract. Kandinsky describes his work as cosmic in many passages of his writings. In numerous of his works, cosmic themes can be felt. His Little Worlds series, we can see here some of them from this series from 1922, evokes possible cosmic realms. Here it is on the screen. Similarly, the following works from Kandinsky evoke cosmic themes. Several Circle from 1920 on the left here, and Heavy Circles from 1927 on the right. I bring your attention to the painting on the left, which shows, geometric forms, or from a more cosmic perspective, an imaginary planet system, and more precisely, a specific moment of celestial alignment, one star with its corona eclipsed by a blue planet and black moon in a single line. A momentary consonance at a cosmic scale, a strange composition of harmony and disharmony along all these celestial bodies, which might also constitute a multiverse. Kandinsky remains rather peripheral in Deleuze and Guattari's works, perhaps because his spiritual endeavor remains too immaterial, too far away from the earth. Kandinsky's work is partly in line with what Deleuze and Guattari say about the cosmicity of modern art, but Kandinsky escaped too fast and went too far away in the spiritual universe, which is not the case of Klee, who is, for Deleuze and Guattari, a true hero of modern age. Clay and Kandinsky were both appointed by the Bauhaus in the 1920s and 30s. They also shared a common interest in cosmicity, as illustrated in many of their works, especially from those years. In his work, Clay was more down to earth, one can say, given his references to terrestrial living creatures. He was a passionate collector of plants, rocks, drawing of animals and mollusks. Clay also had a real scientific curiosity for nature, not only for biology and zoology, but also geology, electromagnetism, energy field, and astronomy. He frequently invited scientists at the Bauhaus to discuss the nature of matter. We can see that his work bridges the gap between natural sciences and artistic creation. However, Clay's ultimate artistic interest is not primarily in the physical nature of the world. By looking at his artwork and by going through his theoretical writings, one can see that he is not looking at nature's outward forms, but rather at the creative energy which animates nature and the universe. As he says, as Clay says, he is primarily interested in the cosmogenesis of things. In many of his paintings, Clay depicts the exchange of energy between living creatures and celestial bodies. All this connects with the idea according to which art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes visible. In Cosmic Flora, that you see here on the screen from 1923, Clay imagines natural beings, unusual plants for that matter, which are exchanging energy with a celestial body, perhaps this here. We see similar lines of energy radiating from the celestial body and curious plants all around here, both inside and outside of them. Clay's Plants and Stars in the following painting, this painting here, we see similar topics explored by Clay. This time, not one, but a series of celestial bodies exchange energies with curious plants, what seems to be rhizomatic roots at the bottom here, are drawn as if they were shooting stars. And the lines on the ground, of the ground, which provides a basis for the plants to grow in the middle, around here, seems to appear in segment floating in the sky, as if the Aristotelian divide between the sublunar and the supralunar worlds became one immanent field. In Ad Marginem from 1930, Clay continues his exploration of the life forces as he tries to render them visible. This time we can see the red star expanding tiny energy lines here, no, around here, and earthly realms wrap around the stars, all around the painting here. As if life incarnated in living creatures, plants, birds, perhaps human at the bottom right here, if you look carefully, were defying gravity, as if the forces of eruption of life were spreading out in various locations on various planets in the margin of their star. So I will skip a few passages and I will now move on to discuss music. I would now like to turn to modern music. The connection between music and the cosmos is even more obvious than compared to painting, to modern painting. It goes back to the theory of the music of the harmonices mundi, initiated by Pythagoras and Plato. The association between music and the motion of celestial bodies, whether harmonious or not, remains a strong belief for many modern composers. We can just think of Gustav Holst's orchestral suite, The Planets from 1916, or George Crumb's Spiral Galaxies from a piece called Macrocosmos from 1973. You see the score, which is a strange score, which has the shape of a spiral galaxy. Or Gérard Griset's work, Le Noir de l'Étoile, an interesting piece from 1990 for percussion and a pulsar. That is a dense little star which rotates incredibly fast on itself and emits beams of light upon each rotation like a cosmic lighthouse. Deleuze and Guattari say about music what Deleuze and Guattari say about music in the cosmic age is quite original compared to the music of the spheres. They don't talk about the music of the humongous celestial spheres, but rather about the tiny molecular refrains, or in French, ritournelles. In chapter 11 of 1,000 Platos, entitled Of the refrain is presented as the primary matter of music. The refrain is not music yet, it is pre-musical, in the sense that it is not a musical composition, but music begins with the refrain, and the goal of music is to deterritorialize the refrain, as Deleuze and Guattari write. That is to take it out of its context, to make it say something else, and to bring it to a different level of reality that will make it say something about the cosmos. The refrain has various functions. For instance, a child in the dark who is comforting himself by singing, someone expressing the joy of doing house cleaning, a bird who is marking its territory or preparing a love parade, people singing at the bar, someone who is leaving or coming back home, or waiting for a friend, etc. These are all refrains. Refrains might look rather banal, but for Deleuze and Guattari, they are at the very foundation of music. They conceive the apparently banal refrain as a complex entity, which has to do with invisible forces, the territory, and with the cosmos as a whole. The cosmos is presented by Deleuze and Guattari as a gigantic refrain composed of various interrelated forces. I wanted to say something about von Uxkes and his conception of the harmony of nature, which is a big source of inspiration for Deleuze and Guattari's conception of nature. But I will skip it because I don't have enough time. We can come back to it. The refrain does not imply an artistic gesture, in the sense that the refrain itself doesn't give thought to the invisible forces that it expresses. The refrain simply intuitively enacts these forces without questioning them, if you will, or without searching for the forces that might be associated with. This is what music composers do, according to Deleuze and Guattari. They grasp the invisible forces that refrains are associated with and find a musical means to express this association. That is what deterritorializing the refrain means for Deleuze and Guattari. The way the refrain is deterritorialized varies from one epoch to another. Each time it finds a cosmological resonance. I will just summarize here, but basically this is the categories that Deleuze and Guattari are using. So classical, romantic, modern, so very well-known categories. And each time the musician, according to Deleuze and Guattari, use different means to deterritorialize the refrain. In classical music, the goal is to keep chaos outside, and the composer is some kind of a god, like Mozart, according to Deleuze and Guattari. In romantic music, illustrated by Schumann here, that Guattari liked very much, the goal is not to re-territorialize music, but rather to territorialize it and to confront, to fight against the forces of the earth. In modern music, illustrated by Stockhausen, here the things are quite different. The goal is now to deterritorialize the music itself in order to reach a sense of cosmic music. Which brings me to Stockhausen. Stockhausen is emblematic of modern cosmic music. He is a pioneer of electronic music, and he was interested, among other things, in aleatory techniques. Theoretically and practically, he works on all parameters of music, namely pitch, duration, dynamics, and timbre. He was perhaps the first serious composer to integrate non-Western style and techniques of composition in music. So I'll present a few of his contributions to music. They show how Stockhausen takes a few steps away from conventional forms. So we will just hear some very short excerpts from Stockhausen, and I will share with you the links. Okay, so I will see if it's working. Okay, I will do like this. Sorry about that. Okay, so the first excerpt from Stockhausen is this. It's his first. It's his first composition for electronic music. It was accompanied it was accompanied by the first published score of electronic music that you see on the screen now. So just a little excerpt. Okay, so you can hear it at home if you'd like the whole piece. But what is interesting is that there is some waves, some sound waves that cannot be heard. In fact, it's integrated in music, but it cannot be heard. The second excerpt, again, very small excerpt. Sorry. Is from a piece called Licht. It's a work that Stockhausen began in '77 and finished in 2003. It's a cycle of 7 opera, one for each day of the week. It has a duration of 29 hours, which is the longest musical piece ever composed. And the plot is based on the esoteric book Urantia. So again, okay, so that was another illustration of the cosmicity, let's say, explored in modern music. The third excerpt.
Alain, I'm very sorry. We are unfortunately running out of time. So
okay.
Please come to the conclusion so that we have enough time for discussion.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that.
No need to apologize. I'm just here to remind you of the time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there was a few excerpts. I will skip it. Yeah, so basically Stockhausen, if you read his interviews and books and what he wrote, and if you listen to his music, it's clearly like it's the cosmic realm is a basic source of inspiration for him. Stockhausen is Deleuze and Guattari refers to Stockhausen, and especially in Thousand Platos, but I think they didn't give enough space to him in their work. And in conclusion, okay, the goal of my presentation was to make consistent the quote we began with. Is a modern art. It is, of course, the age of the cosmic. Artists never cease to express nature and the universe, but the perspective on nature and the universe changed in modern age. Nature is not merely three-dimensional, it is n-dimensional. The modern artists, Deleuze and Guattari, find inspiring, explore the invisible forces that animate, constitute, affect, and are affected in return by nature and the universe. Not only are these forces not sensible, but they are also abstract, or they are abstract because they are not perceivable by the eyes and ears, not properly thinkable by the philosophers. So I will simply stop here. Thank you very much.
Alain, thank you very much for a rich and beautiful, aesthetically beautiful presentation. I enjoyed it very much. And I would like to open discussion. So,
Okay.
and if there are no questions, I already have one. Ewa, go ahead.
Okay, okay, because I'm not really used, because there's the screen, but it doesn't matter. So it was an amazing presentation, extremely inspiring, Alain. Thank you. What just came to my mind, and I'm really curious whether you agree with me or not, is that there was the moment when you noticed that some elements were in the art before they appeared in the cosmology. And what I remember was always really fascinating for me, like a kind of a intuition, that there is really nothing like a star as such, like in cosmology, or a planet or something. So it's always inspired. I mean, the name we call, I mean, I know if you know what I mean, the gesture to name a star purely, it's not only a scientific gesture, but it's somehow inspired. Otherwise, we would call it, I don't know, a chair. From some reasons, this is the black hole, or from some reason there is some. So I mean, in general, there are some attempts of contemporary cosmologists who say that that the cosmology as such is more metaphorical than we really think. And this, what I have from your presentation as a thing, is that you were able to show it on the layer of philosophy and art. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. If I can add briefly to it, yeah, I agree with you. The cosmology, there is a pretension, a claim, a false claim or wrong claim by scientists who claim to be able to describe the world objectively, in its pure objectivity. And very often, the scientists, when they look at the artistic works that are presented, they say, oh, they found inspiration in our objective theories. But it might be the reverse. It might be that scientists, in fact, scientists, they need to use their imagination and their humanity, let's say, to create their theories. So there is no, in that sense, pure objectivity. There is some kind of objectivity that science is describing and is grasping, but it's only, I would say, half of reality. There is another half that is purely based on the imagination. And if you look at the cosmological theories, the theory of the origin of the universe, the Big Bang, etc., well, it's an anthropomorphic model. It begins and it might end in a big crunch, etc. And the scientists, they don't have a sense of the infinity, a possible infinite universe in space and time. It escapes the mind of the scientist. The objectivity of their endeavor, their quest, and so the real cosmologists, the scientist cosmologists that I find really interested are the ones who are leaving place to a pure speculation. They don't try to ground their theory on empirical evidence. And so I think there's a lot of that in cosmology today. And not only, of course, there is some kind of objectivity that we can find in cosmology, but again, this objectivity of the origin and the finality, the destiny of the universe, is only part of reality. And this is, I think, what Deleuze is pointing out. There's another side to the coin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then there is a second question in a chat. Sonia asks, so maybe.
Okay.
You wanna...
So, thanks. I wonder if there is. I can read it and out loud.
Yeah.
If there is a molecular cosmic point of fusion where the limit that divides quantum physics and esoteric metaphysics disappear, and only a co-movement of Genesis roles producing non-formalized sound and new artistic expression, then cosmicity would be in the genesis and not in the structured results per se. Something like a phenomenology of matter. What would be your thoughts on this? Well, it seems to me a very complex question, but and I don't know if I can answer precisely to it, but certainly Deleuze and Guattari, and in fact also Paul Klee, were interested in the genesis of things, how things could have started, and it leaves place in their thought to speculation, as opposed to a perspective, another philosophical or scientific perspective that would be more interested in the things that are already constituted. There is certainly a genesis or cosmogenesis perspective in Deleuze. Then I would have to reread. Sorry, because English is not my mother tongue. Non-formalized sound and new artistic. Yeah, the non-formalized sound in music. I think this is what Stockhausen and also in painting what Kandinsky and Klee are exploring is to get rid of the pre-existing forms. So they want to, and this is what Deleuze and Guattari are pointing at, they want to grasp things as they are existing, coming to life. So the intensity of things, as opposed, so they go beyond the matter-form divide in order to reach the intensity of the world. So again, I would, if I read the question well, there is this genetic perspective and this attempt to escape the form that is common to, let's say, modern music, and as Deleuze and Guattari understand it, and also their own philosophy. So I hope I got some of this question. Sorry for my complex formulation. Oh, that's okay. Life is complex. So, yeah, everything is complex. Thanks for your question.
Alain, thank you very much once again. It was a wonderful presentation, but unfortunately,
1 minute only to Michael. I mean, 30 seconds. I got the idea of your question, which is really it's a very good question. Now I got it. So the point is, it will be one sentence only. I ended my presentation with one sentence. So the second perspective is when there is an external reference frame needed to cut, to subject, in other words, to enslave. And this is exactly the transcendental point which is needed, but which Deleuze rejects. So I just showed the scenario, but this ion chronos structure and the frame of reference is implemented in the quantum mechanic, true, but this is what Deleuze is trying to, I would say, even fight with. So you're right. Now I got it. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to assure Michael that he will have enough time for his presentation. We will go beyond the limits of this panel, but then there is 30 minutes break, and it's no tragedy if we spend a little bit more time together. I think it would be pity to cut off this discussion. And there is one more question from Angelica. So this would be very last question for Alain. Maybe Alain, if you could react, and then we will give a word to Michael.
Okay, I will try to answer briefly Angelica's question. Thank you for the great talk. Thank you. I wonder, do you see a difference in methodology and type of art and science in their ways to make the invisible visible? Art by abstraction or subtraction from the Mahler, science, on the other hand, by concretization of the molecular. Okay, thanks for your question. Again, a very complex question. Do you see a difference in methodology? Well, in methodology, Well, it depends which scientist we are referring to. Some scientists are very evidence-based, grounded. So they want to they want to avoid speculation, and they consider that philosophy is dead. Like Stephen Hawking wrote that at some point, and the only way to grasp reality is to develop theories that will describe objectively the world. And of course, Deleuze and Guattari wants to escape this, and some scientists as well, especially Russian scientists. They leave a lot of room and lot of place in their cosmological views to speculation and hypothesis, and they don't feel the need to ground their theories in empirical evidence. This is the way they can develop, for instance, theories about the multiverse and the bubble universe. All this, we will never be able, it seems, to escape our own world. So it becomes very difficult to speculate about other worlds. But some cosmologists, they share this kind of views that Deleuze has. But I would say the majority of the cosmologists in science, they don't. And in art, just briefly, it would be wrong, I think, to consider that all of modern artists would agree to Deleuze and Guattari, because they are in fact too speculative, too metaphysical, and not enough into the artistic matter itself. So the answer would be yes and no. Some share their methodology, artists and scientists, and some don't. This is a short answer. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alain. And now, please allow me to introduce Michael J. Ardoline from the University of Memphis, who will talk about powers of pure difference, Deleuze, dispositionalism, and necessary truth. Michael, the stage is yours.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'll say the point of this paper is to use Deleuze to answer how necessary truths are metaphysically grounded. My answer to that question is it's because difference itself is ineliminable, and difference has powers of its own, and so it can ground necessary truths such as those as mathematics. This is part of a larger project of using Deleuze's account of difference itself to solve problems in analytic metaphysics. In this paper, I focus specifically on my presentation of the notion of difference itself, geared towards an analytic audience. And so if you have any strategic suggestions about that, I would appreciate them in the question and answer. I do so in response to a specific problem that is for the dispositionalists in the relationship between modal metaphysics and modal logic. So dispositionalism is the stance that claims that possibility and necessity, or claims about possibility and necessity, are made true by the existence of powers or potentialities, which those claims would then accurately describe. This is opposed to the mainstream in analytic philosophy, which takes claims about metaphysical possibility to be made true simply by not entailing a contradiction or by being true at a possible world, and claims about necessity as true if a proposition is true in all possible worlds. Now, there is much affinity between Deleuze's metaphysics and the dispositionalist approach to modality. Both seek to ground an account of what may be or become the case in terms of powers of concrete rather than abstract objects. Deleuze's famous, the abstract is not explained, but must itself be explained. However, they differ in the question of whether difference or identity has metaphysical primacy. I argue that the dispositionalist should accept the primacy of difference in order to successfully respond to an important criticism. This criticism is the question of how to account for necessary truths in a dispositionalist framework. So I'm going to go into this debate first, and then I'm going to provide an answer to it based on Deleuze. It's going to be geared towards an analytic presentation, but I'm going to skip most of the like technical logical derivation details. So the goal of dispositionalism about modality is to provide a metaphysics which grounds modal truths, so truths about possibility and necessity, in the dispositions or powers of concrete objects. In doing so, this approach entails a rejection of possible worlds as playing any explanatory role in metaphysics or ontology. This is not necessarily a challenge for the formal tools of modal logic, of possible world semantics, or any such usefulness thereof, but a challenge to the metaphysics that these logical tools have been taken to imply. The debate of central importance of this paper is that between Yates 2014 and Vedder 2018, on whether or not powers alone can ground necessary truths. Yates calls the views in question strong dispositionalism and defines this position as, quote, something is possible if and only if there's a power that can make it the case, and something is necessary if and only if there is not a power which cannot make it the case. Yates then argues that there are no powers which can bring about a necessary truth such as 2 + 2 = 4, a condition he distinguishes from 2 + 2 happening to be true when a power is manifested. So the distinction here is an obscure one, but the distinction is not what is going on while 2 + 2 = 4 is true, but what power could actually make that the case? Like what could cause that to be true? Cause is a weird word, but you get the idea. So as a necessary truth, 2 + 2 = 4 will be the case whenever any power is manifested. However, that is not enough to justify that power as a truth maker for 2 + 2 = 4, as any specific power's manifestation does not make that true. Yates goes on to deny that any such power could exist because, quote, making 2 + 2 = 4 is not the sort of thing that powers are to do, end quote, although he provides no argument for this. If this is the case, then this is also a problem for formal adequacy, not just getting the right truths. Because if this is so, then dispositionalists would have to admit that it is possible that 2 + 2 = 4 is false, because possibility depends on there being a power to make it the case. If so, then dispositionalist fails at material adequacy because there will be necessary truths which turn out to be possibly false. And this is a straightforward contradiction in modal logic. If something's necessarily true, you should be able to derive that it's possibly true. Yates' charge goes further in that while one may be a fictionalist about mathematics, that is, you might take mathematics to not be true in the same sense as something like physics is, but it's still a useful game or a self-consistent formal system. So one may be a fictionalist about mathematics and so disagree at what satisfies truth conditions or material adequacy, but his challenge spills over into a failure of formal adequacy. This means that Yates's charge is not the same as the claim that mathematical truths are empty, but rather claims that the strong dispositionalists cannot even account for correct logical deductions from mathematical statements, which, of course, if true, would just mean the dispositionalists cannot account for mathematical truth, period, and then cannot account for the truths of science, which depend on. Now, in response, Barbara Vedder embraces a strengthened position, which Yates entertains as an objection. This is the plenitudes of power. This plenitudes of powers position, as envisioned by Yates, is one in which the strong dispositionalist says, but wait, there could be a power that makes 2 + 2 = 4, and that it's necessary because everything is always manifesting such a power. Now, Yates brings this up as an objection and then rejects it. He says this position is either excessive and leads to what is called modal bloat, which is if a truth is necessary, then any object makes it true. And so somehow the greening of trees or the flying of planes makes 2 + 2 = 4, which is absurd. Or the position is ad hoc, which is we posit some exotic or magic power for no reason other than to fill the gaps in our metaphysical grounds. Now, Vedder wants to say one can posit a power that makes 2 + 2 = 4, but doesn't fall into either of these problems. And so let's first reconstruct her version. Now, she sharpens the position by arguing that it would be enough for any object to just have an always manifested disposition, as a power that's always active, which makes it the case that 2 + 2 = 4. And as long as, so just one thing that has that power, and as long as nothing has the power to make it not the case that 2 + 2 = 4, then this would satisfy the account. This would not be modal bloat because there'd be just one power, or maybe one or two powers, but it wouldn't mean everything implies every necessary truth. And it would also not be ad hoc if we can give an independent reason for believing in whatever power makes these things true. Now it's here that Vedder splits this into two claims. She says there's the necessary manifestation challenge, which she takes to herself to have resolved. That is, there are some powers that are just always active, always doing what they do, and those would be the types of powers we're looking for to ground necessary truths. What she doesn't answer is what she calls the whose power challenge, which is, okay, here are these powers that are always activating that can ground necessary truths. What type of object, what thing could actually have those powers? And she leaves this open. Now, this is the gap that I want to fill with a positive account of difference coming from Deleuze. And so to see what it means to fulfill this position, it's helpful to first look at why positing abstract objects might appear to be a viable solution, but ultimately fails. So one might suggest that the abstract object 4 exists, and that the object 4 has a power of equaling 2 plus 2. Now, we can see this as ad hoc because we would be just providing an object that we have no reason to believe in the existence of, other than the fact that it fills this role in the theory of we have a necessary truth, it needs a power that makes it true. And we posit it because the dispositionalist account, as currently constructed, argues that powers are of objects. And so there aren't powers well, things would be the wrong word, but there aren't powers that we can attribute beyond an object. Now, I take it if we reject this assumption that powers must be powers of an object, a new range of powers is made available for explanation. That is, powers which exist due to there being different objects at all. A power of this sort is only possible given several different objects, of which it is jointly the power. In other words, in order for such a power to exist, it requires the maintaining of the differences of the objects of which it is the power. And so therefore it cannot be said to be a power of any one object. Now, I will argue from powers which exist like this, that is, so long as there is a difference between objects, to the existence of powers that exist due to any difference at all, and argue that we should call those powers powers of difference itself. And this entails the claim that difference is not an object. This latter claim, I take it, will be an explication of Deleuze's claim that difference is positive and metaphysically fundamental. Now, here's the argument. Certain dispositions require more than being the dispositions of an object in order to exist. Consider a heat sink. To be able to act as a heat sink, that is, to be an object with the right dispositions to serve as a heat sink in a computer, for example. This requires that the object have a certain thermal conductivity and other such properties that are indeed properties of that object. However, this is not enough heat sink. The dispositions which make something a good or bad heat sink for a specific also depend on that object's difference from the system of which it is a part. For example, is the object hotter than the external environment? Is it significantly better at dissipating heat than the object for which it is the heat sink? Now, phrases like cooler than and better at dissipating heat than are not dispositions that can be said of an object in itself, nor are they mere comparisons. These and other specifications do not obtain, then the object will not have the power to act as a heat sink, that is, to cool the part it is connected to by dissipating heat to the wider environment. To say of something that it could be a potential heat sink in such and such an environment, which does not actually obtain, would be only to sort of predicate a mere Cambridge property. That is, a property that the thing has only in my mind or in my thinking of it, not actually in the object itself. We could, of course, through understanding the disposition of an object, say that it can counterfactually operate as a heat sink in such and such environment, but that is not to say it has a current power, only that it could acquire that power in given circumstances. If this is the case, then there are dispositions, there's powers, which exist only insofar as difference is maintained. Here, the difference in thermal conductivity between the heat sink and what it's the heat sink for. Now, these are not yet grounds of necessary truths, nor are they powers of difference themselves. Powers such as that of the heat sink still depend in no small part on the object itself. On the other hand, powers of difference itself would be powers which exist due only to the existence of difference, irrespective of the objects differing. In other words, powers which do not depend on the differences of any specific objects, and so can be said to be powers of difference as such. This is then to say that there is a positive account of difference at work, positive in the dispositional sense of having dispositions rather than being the lack of a disposition, that is, of not having a power. There is then an important difference between powers of pure difference and powers of what we might call aggregates or multiple interacting objects, like the heat sink. We can separate these two types of powers by taking the aggregate object as if a single object. If the single object remains a truth maker for possible states of affairs then the powers that make it possible are not powers of difference itself. That is, if you take an assemble of things as if it were one thing. For example, whether my car's engine is taken as a whole with its own identity or as an aggregate of parts, piston, motor, flywheel, etc., which does not have a single identity, whichever way we take this, does not affect its power to carry such and such a mass at such and such a speed. Taking it as a whole versus taking it as an aggregate of parts does, however, affect whether the object can stand as truth makers for objects which require a difference between objects. And this is not to say that the way we mentally carve up the world grants these powers, rather is to say that were these objects to fuse into a single object with no real positive difference between them, then there would be no way for it to stand as a truth maker for 2 + 2 = 4, even though its unfused parts could have. That is, if we take the engine as a whole, as one unit, it doesn't stand as a truth maker for this claim for 2 + 2 = 4 because there's one thing. There's nothing to stand in for the multiplicity that we'd need to have addition and define numbers larger than 1. With the erasure of difference, then, comes the loss of certain powers. Therefore, there exist powers which are not the powers of any specific or individual object, or even powers of groups of objects or aggregates, but which still depend on the existence of objects. We can then make use of a new type of power, what I'm calling a power of pure difference, or a power of difference itself, without adding anything to the dispositionalist ontology. In other words, difference is not added to our ontology. It is already implied as long as our ontology has more than one object or power. Now, I don't know any dispositionalists which are neo-Parmenideans as well, but that's the problem with Parmenideans. There's always one. So if this is the case, then difference is ineliminable. It is only these powers that result from any difference at all that can give rise to necessary truths. If these are rightly called dispositions or powers, then they fit the profile of necessarily always active dispositions that Vedder outlined earlier. Difference itself is not the sort of thing which goes away, which turns off and on, which has stimulus conditions, etc., etc. And so its powers are always active. And insofar as it is not possible for there not to be difference, they are necessarily so. Now, I imagine the most direct objection to this proposal is that difference is not the sort of thing which we normally predicate powers of, or that such predication of difference is somehow incorrect or mistaken. Now, for the dispositionalist, like I said earlier, powers are a set of objects, and I'm trying to argue that they should be set of something else, and what we're calling difference itself, and to not consider difference itself as an object. Therefore, the objection goes: either difference is not the sort of thing that can have powers, or difference itself must be reified into an object which then has those powers, and we have to then accept into our ontology as such. If the former claim of the disjunct holds, then the proposal is thrown right out. If the second, then this proposal breaks its promise to not add any sort of ad hoc objects. The object difference itself, which can be predicated of all the powers of arithmetic, would clearly be an abstract and non-actual object, to say nothing of being ad hoc. Now, I take this objection to be a result of an ill-formed notion of difference as only the difference between specific objects, and the fact that analytic philosophy hasn't taken up Heidegger's critique of ontotheology, but that's a different point. So this first point, that it's an ill-formed notion of difference as lack, or as a negative difference between objects, follows from misreading claims that two objects are different as claims about the differences between two objects. This misreading implies a relative notion of difference, as any difference will be the difference between two or more things, and so will depend entirely on what those two things that are differing are. And we may also call this, as I said above, a negative conception of difference, because difference on this account is understood as not that. Establishing a systematic metaphysics of difference is beyond the scope of this paper. Given that, though, I'll take as a starting point a feature of Deleuze's account of objects, which many dispositionalists are also committed to. That is, degrees of the manifestation of powers, or what Deleuze would call intensities. Now, intensities are more than that, but I'm limiting the scope here for this argument. It is useful to begin here both because it does not require positing anything beyond objects and their dispositions, and it avoids the pitfalls of reducing difference in general, talk of difference between specific objects. Focusing on objects alone risks making talk of difference itself sound like talk of negative difference, of the not that. We can more easily see this positive notion of difference already at work in the difference of degrees of a power. These degrees of a power are central to Vedder's argument as well. The power itself, in some strong sense, is these differences of degree. That is, intensity is difference. Heating up is the disposition to increase in degrees of temperature, and so is a power to undergo difference from one degree to another due to a certain input of energy. The question is, in what way do these degrees exist? Now, to say difference is positive is to claim that something's identity is grounded in difference. That this is the case for degrees is easily shown. In fact, let's start with the reductio, with the reverse claim. If one rejects the grounding of degrees in difference, then they are positing the existence of degrees simultaneously. Dispositions with degrees involve the way in which an object moves from one degree to another. If difference is grounded on identity, then in order for there to be a difference between, say, an object at 95 degrees Fahrenheit and that same object at 96 degrees Fahrenheit, then those degrees must exist first in order to give rise to the difference between them. That is, there must be an identity for each degree, and then the difference between 95 and 96 degrees exists only based on those two degrees existing somehow simultaneously. This is clearly mistaken, as it treats the different degrees as if actual, and cannot make sense of the degrees as potential or virtual, or as changing into one another. One might then try to save a grounding identity by saying that each degree is a different power. This is both clearly formally problematic and materially false, in that we do not find an object containing all of its potential degrees of temperature, but rather as an object having a specific heat. And specific heat here is the thermodynamics term, not a term for having a determinate temperature, but the term for having a capacity that however much energy it takes to raise your temperature or the temperature of that object 1 degree. So they have a specific heat. They have a certain disposition, which describes its disposition to be heated or cooled alongside whatever particular temperature is currently manifest. Were each degree its own power, we should expect its continuities. Now an object actualizes its power of 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and then a moment later it immediately actualizes its power of 80 degrees Fahrenheit with no in between. This is clearly absurd, as such a change would actually be continuous in any real sense. Now, one might respond that this does not make the case that degrees of a power imply a grounding of difference itself, but only establishes that degrees of a power cannot themselves be fundamental. For the sake of argument, let us propose that there is some other way of grounding degrees, say a dispositional essence. That is, the object has an essence, and that essence is made up of its powers. And that in that essential power is the various degrees, the power to manifest those degrees. We must then ask still, what makes each degree what it is? What is it to actualize 100 degrees rather than 101? Why is it the same thing for an object? Why is it the same thing for an object to actualize 100 degrees Celsius and 210 degrees Fahrenheit? If we cannot make use of difference positively, say here a difference within the dispositional essence of an object or its material parts, then we are forced to again posit an identity for each individual degree. Therefore, every degree of a power will require its own essence, its own disposition, which makes it the degree that it is. That is, each object in its essence would have a power to manifest 100 degrees, a power to manifest 101 degrees, and so on. And then every object would have infinite powers, which is ridiculous. We would then be in a similar problem as above. Such a mistake would only arise from taking the quantified presentation of temperature as degrees rather than the phenomenon of temperature itself. Instead, we may say with Deleuze that what it is to be any degree is to be different than that previous degree. Therefore, the dispositionalist who makes use of degrees is already implicitly using a notion of positive difference to ground modal fact. That we then find positive difference even at the heart of disposition, and thereby dispositions or powers, and thereby at the heart of objects themselves, should be no surprise to us, as it explains, and I think explains away, the odd sophism of finding as contradiction in an object with different properties being both one and many. Furthermore, it is precisely this unique form of change that we see in the movement from one degree to another that gives rise to the notion of intensity historically as a medieval concept with Aristotelian roots. When an object's temperature is raised, a new degree is not added on. Rather, the object's temperature has intensified to the next degree. It's become different than it was, while remaining in kind the same sort of thing. Since there is no degree waiting somewhere to be added, it's not just like in the possible and we add a possible degree onto an actual, and now it's actually a degree more. It is rather the change itself, the difference from degree to degree, which constitutes the order of degrees in the first place. All of this, I claim, is implicated if we accepted the existence of degrees of manifestation of a power. The above defeats the first part of the objection, the claim that powers can or should not be said of difference itself. However, this does risk falling into the second part of the objection, that we'd have to take difference as an object. To avoid this, it must then be established that positive difference cannot be an object. This is simple if abstract. An object must be individuated to be an object, but difference itself cannot be individuated. To individuate difference is to claim to have an identity of difference. Now, clearly this falls into a contradiction. If identity is taken as primary, then we fall into the problem of negative difference explicated above. That is, difference is only understood as being different from something else. Here, difference from the identity of difference. If, on the other hand, there is a primary difference which has its own identity, it cannot account for anything which is different from it. And so, whatever else it may be, difference cannot itself be an object, again, because objects have to be individuated, and being individuated means to have an identity, and an identity of difference is a contradiction. I take this to respond to Yates' ad hoc objection against the strong dispositionalist because no new objects have been proposed, and reasons independent of grounding modal truths have been given for accepting a positive notion of difference. That is, such a positive notion of difference is not an object, so it's not added to our ontology, and it explains how intensities work, how intensive change is different from, say, extensive change. And so I have argued that the existence of difference itself is enough to stand for truth makers for the necessary truths of arithmetic. This defeats the charge of formal inadequacy and ad hocery made by Yates. Furthermore, I have argued that such a notion of positive difference must already be implicitly endorsed by dispositionalists and any other actualists who make use of degrees of manifestations of powers in order to ground modal propositions. Well, I think that difference may actually provide the grounds for all necessary truths, which cannot be grounded in concrete objects. That remains to be established. Perhaps most obvious among future projects is how to scale up from the truth of arithmetic, here grounded, to other branches of mathematics, especially any branch which deals in transfinite sets, or the transfinite such as set theory. At most, here a metaphysical ground has been established for propositions about countable sets. At minimum, difference has only been shown here to ground propositions about sets no larger than the number of objects in the universe. Now, while incomplete, I take this to certainly be an advance above not being able to make 2 + 2 = 4. Thank you. Oh, I think your microphone is off. Peter, I think your microphone is off, or it's not coming through. Oh.
So, Michael, thank you very much for awesome presentation. It was really excellent. absolutely clear and sharp argumentation. I really enjoyed it. So I wonder if there are some questions, comments. Of course, you can type your questions and comments in the chat. And if there are Alain.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for your presentation. I would like to. I don't know if you had time to think about it, but in What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari makes a strong critique of analytic philosophy, Wittgenstein, and so on. And I see that you refer to this tradition. So what do you make of their critique of logic and analytic philosophy and Wittgenstein and this tradition?
So one of the weird aeonic effects of time, of having a year delayed, is I originally wrote this paper as the sort of setup to my dissertation. And so I wrote it when I was just starting the project. And in the time that we've been delayed a year, I've since written the dissertation and defended it. And it was sort of trying to answer that question in a lot of ways. And what I take them to be doing in that section, especially when you get into the critiques of Frege as reducing the concept to an extensive function, and so missing what else a concept can do or what a concept really is, and the section where they discuss set theory. What I take that to be doing is rejection, but a sort of limiting what we're talking about. And I think what they're arguing is that these tools of the tradition of analytic philosophy, starting with Frege and developing through this synthesis or the symbiosis alongside the development of formal logic and these questions of the grounding of mathematics, is very good at handling the extensive. It's very good at handling the things that an identity has been produced of. Similarity is, you can actually recognize and represent it through similarity, and that it can be easily quantified, or maybe difficultly quantified, but can still be quantified without losing what it is we're talking about. And I take their point to be, that is very good for physics, where you are coordinating systems of quantification and you're predicting what's happening and you're using functions and extensive tools. It's very good for the predictive sciences. There's just a whole bunch of stuff in reality that isn't extensive, and the intensive explains how the extensive is generated. And I try to take that insight and argue that I extend this paper and argue that that's actually what gives us truth makers for mathematics in the first place, is that one of the powers of difference is the way in which intensity, through self-differentiating, actually produces identities, produces the extensive, and produces the quantifiable. And so my argument is basically that if that reading of Deleuze is right and we run with it, what we get is mathematics is the science that studies that process of the modal structure of the production of the quantifiable. And so the short answer is, I think that their critique is not a rejection, but a limitation of where mathematics, where formal logic are most effective. And that if we put it in this larger metaphysics, we can explain that, and we can get a really good account of why mathematical truths are the way they are, without pointing to something like Plato's heaven, or without being a fictionalist where we say, oh, it's just the rules of a game that for some reason unlocks the secrets of the cosmos, but we don't know why.
I mean, okay, so
Sure,
sorry, but my English is not good enough to follow you completely. So might be that my question is irrelevant, because it would be a pleasure for me to read your presentation someday, and then I could, in details, go into some details. But what was just buzzing all around my head was that, I mean, that the physics is like the living thing as such, and this is why I think it can be, for some at least, seducing as far as Deleuzean cosmology or Deleuzean philosophy. But I don't know if Deleuze would ever say that there is any 2 + 2, which is any 5. So this is any 4. I mean, whatever he would say, I mean, I would say that 2 + 2 would be fruit salad, or I mean, just like a joke. But what I want to say, like seriously, is that the notion of being as such, the notion of time, the notion of space, I mean, everywhere, being considered differently, are the one that are the living one. And mathematics and just the analytical gesture as such is at start just taking things like object, like they are conceptualized as such, so they are like without life. I'm just wondering if there is any 2 + 2, which is 4 for Deleuze. So this is just a question.
So I think that's a great question.
I don't know.
And no, very much is, because part of the bigger project was sort of looking at 2 different things. One of which was the question of how can you have can a philosophy of pure difference, a philosophy of flux and change and movement like Deleuze, can it make sense of necessary truths? If it can't, now my background is originally physics, then through continental philosophy, and then only recently have I started dealing with the analytic side of things in the last few years. But if Deleuze's philosophy couldn't deal with mathematics or couldn't make sense of physics or what we're doing there, I'd have to say it was a non-starter. I don't want to do that because I love Deleuze. But then, so first question is, how can a philosophy of flux and change make sense of stable truths? The second thing is, can Deleuze offer something that the metaphysics of mathematics needs? And the metaphysics of mathematics is not really changed much since Plato, in that there's some people who think that there is just an other world of forms, or there's some ideal abstract entities that are what make our statements about math true, or there is just a formal game that happens to work, and for some reason that gives a special language, but it doesn't make it true in any real sense. And there's a few other positions in between. And I think if you ask those 2 questions together, and when you bring Deleuze to it, what you get to say is, we get the mathematical truths, we get a metaphysical explanation for why we get the necessary truths we want, without having to posit abstract objects. And I claim that we do that by saying mathematics studies the extensive parts of the process of change, or the ways in which things that differ sometimes become extensive, they become similar, or they become quantifiable. When you look at Deleuze's account of individuation, or let's look at actualization because it's easier. You have the virtual, which is different, like self-differentiating moving mass, but there's a structure to it, and there's a structure of the virtual covering over differences to produce what is actual, and the actual is extensive and filled with qualities. And that structure doesn't change. There will be new things that are produced, and that structure is built on change. So, it's when Deleuze says the form of change which does not itself change. And so my claim is that, well, if we want to know why mathematics is stable, why it's this unique form of truth, which I think it is.
Gödel incompleteness theorem. Gödel incompleteness theorem, that there is in every system which is axiomatic full, there are truths which are both impossible to be proved and both impossible to be declined. So this just came to my mind. So right. I mean, it's not an objection. Don't treat it that way. But I think it could be fun to dig it deeper. I mean, the very I would say ontological status of mathematics as such, because I think it's like quite a journey to go. Right. It's more risky, I would say.
Right. I think Deleuze has a good story to tell us about Gödel, actually, which is that the extensive depends on the intensive. You are not going to be able to give a fully extensive algorithmic, Gödel structured thing that gives you a closed system, and yet still deals with every possible mathematical statement and can check it, because the world is built on chaos. That chaos does have a structure that we can study, and insofar as that structure itself does not change, that that difference is fundamental, that objects need to be individuated, that individuation happens through a complex play of intensity, of covering over difference, and of the actualization of the virtual. As long as structure in play. My claim is that if we look at the details of that and work it out, we can argue that mathematics studies a portion of that. And so mathematics gets its special status as necessary truths because everything in the universe is the structured individuation of difference, the differentiation of difference. And so if that structure remains, then that will ground stable truths. And that math is that study. And so it's necessary, but it's not necessary in ascendant play in this sense. So if the heat death of the universe is right and the universe dies one day, I think math will die with it. But the truths of mathematics will persist as long as there is a universe, and they will persist as they are.
Okay, I'm afraid we are running out of time. And if we don't want to miss Etienne Balibar's lecture, which would be a terrible shame, we need to slowly end this session. But let me just explain myself and my excitement about Michael's talk, because, there is one more question, and I would rather leave place to the questions than presenting my own ideas. So let's take this last comment or question from Vicky as an opportunity to say goodbye. And of course, Michael, we can keep in touch and discuss my impressions. So if you can react to Vicky's answer, and then this will be the end for today.
Great. I have a very quick answer to this, which is I very much like Laurel's notion of sort of Gnostic thing is going on, but I have doing, and I've tried to read them, and I'd love to understand them more. But so probably some inspiration, but I wish I knew more about his thinking.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I will just cut the long story short and tell what. Well, there is one more, one more comment. So I let you answer to that.
Oh yeah, so that's a very perceptive question. I'm in the paper as written, I'm trying to pitch it to an analytic audience, and so that means words like actual and concrete. I'm trying to use the analytic definitions for, and in fact, I kind of used concrete here as a way of avoiding the equivocation between what the analytic means by actual, which means like in the actual world, and so includes the whole history of this world, depending on the view you're talking about, versus the Deleuzian account of like this specific subset of reality of what's going on now, which is extensive, which is, all these other things. And so I think you're very much right there in that. Let's see. It seems to me rather you're trying to provide an extensive interpretation of the notion of DX. Yeah. So when I'm talking about the concrete here, I'm talking about the thing that the analytic wants to separate from abstract, like possibilia, like possible worlds, like things outside of this world. And so if I was going to translate that into Deleuzian terms, I'd have to change that a good bit. But exactly, I'm talking about the extensive features of reality and only trying to explain how those and the process that produces extensivity grounds mathematics. And so I do think the dx, dy, the calculus stuff is really important here. But if you, in that section, Deleuze even goes so far as to say, this is not even the calculus, even the dy, dx relation is not a perfect representation of difference, because difference doesn't have a perfect representation. And so a lot of this project is taking that insight and trying to expand it to the whole of grounding mathematics, rather than doing the how is Deleuze inspired by the calculus project. But no, that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, so once again, I would like to thank to our three speakers, to those who asked questions and all those who attended this panel. Thank you very much, and let's hurry up so that we don't miss Etienne Balibar's lecture.
Yeah, Peter, thank you very much for sharing this session and also for organizing this amazing conference. There's a lot of work behind it.
Amazing. To organize.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
Peter.
Thank you.
See you. See you.
Bye.